Mr. Reed Benson is going to act as moderator for this session, and I'm sure I don't need to introduce Reed to you. Not only does he write for American Opinion and Review of the News, you know him also as having been Public Relations Director for the John Birch Society and being now a Washington representative and in charge of the Washington office. Reed is an outstanding conservative on his own part, as well as being an ordained minister in the Mormon Church. He has been tremendously helpful at many of these rallies. We always lean on him quite successfully whenever we have a problem, and it is always satisfactorily performed, and we are delighted always to have Reed with us. We have him scheduled later on in the program as well, but it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you at the moment Mr. Reed Benson.
It's a real pleasure to be with you here tonight and to have the privilege of introducing the famous father of a famous son. You know, that's a real privilege for a conservative to have a posterity that turns out conservative also. And I think one of the greatest tributes to this man that I want to mention tonight is the fact that he's the father of the editor of the Indianapolis News, M. Stanton Evans, one of the most prominent conservatives in this country. Now, this good man received his training, his PhD, a number of years ago at Yale. It's nice to have one that went through there and came out on our side. He got his degree in English, his doctorate degree in English, and he taught English and history for some 17 years in Southern colleges. He became the chief of security training for the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission until he resigned in 1953 to write the book, The Secret War for the A-Bomb. You that have read the Blue Book of the John Birch Society know about the treatment that that book received. He also has been the author of two other conservative books, The Usurpers, The Assassination of Joe McCarthy. Today he serves as the associate editor of American Opinion and its book review editor. And he is also the managing editor of The Citizen and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Council School Foundation in Jackson, Mississippi. A few years ago in Jackson, my father had the privilege of being introduced to the leadership conference of the Citizens Councils of America by our speaker here tonight, Medford Evans. Tonight I feel it's my privilege to be able to return the compliment and to introduce to you the man who will speak on the topic of the new private schools, a distinguished American, Dr. Medford Evans.
Ladies and gentlemen, you must know how much it means to me to have that gracious and elegantly prepared introduction from one of the leading patriots and conservatives of this nation, whose father is one of the greatest men that I have ever personally met, who was, if I may say so, Reed, the redemption of the Eisenhower administration. And certainly, I appreciate Reed's bringing up the theme of the father-son continuum. And it is a fact that the so-called generation gap is, to a large extent, the creation of an invidious public relations industry. And certainly, it is a wonderful joy for a father to know that his son is continuing the most vital and sacred traditions of our race, our civilization, our religion, our country. And certainly no son has done that more superbly well than Reed Benson. As Reed told you, I was a college teacher for some 17 years, and I did go through 4 years of graduate work at one of the so-called Ivy League universities. So naturally, I have a certain amount of paraphernalia here, and if you'll bear with me, I'll get it straightened out. I don't need that part, I don't think. I wrote my speech, and as Woodrow Wilson reportedly once said, having written a very long letter, he apologized to the recipient and said, "I'm sorry this letter is so long, I didn't have time to write a short one." Now, I wrote a speech which got to be twice too long, and I wasn't through. But I had to quit writing and go back and start cutting out. So I have cut it down to where I think I can read it in the allotted time. But I will try to read rather fast to try to get it all. And if I left out in the cutting process, if I left out any essential connecting transitional passages, I hope you won't be too much confused. But I do believe that this is a subject, whatever the treatment may be, that this is a subject in which all patriotic Americans are interested these days. I've called this the new private schools, the free enterprise answer to the crisis in education. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So begins the basic law of the land. It is hard to read that now without a sense of bitter irony. Not to go into such controversial questions as whether we do indeed have a more perfect union, have indeed established justice, and have truly promoted the general welfare, nothing could be more obvious than that we are tragically short on domestic tranquility, and though we have provided for the common defense by squandering of dollars unequaled in the history of mankind, some of us, none of us can feel any sense of security in a defense establishment where drug addiction is said to be rampant in the ranks, while the highest echelons plan strategy and promulgate policy ranging from mutual assured destruction, which spells mad, to ping-pong diplomacy with the perpetrators of the most massive Red Terror in history. Such aberrations are hardly to be explained even by pot, acid, speed, or heroin. They are explicable, if at all, only by reference to the ultimate madness of communism with its plans to rebuild the Tower of Babel. But there is an even deeper sense in which our government has now departed from the intent of the constitutional fathers. The men of 1787 proposed to secure the blessings of liberty for themselves and their posterity. Our government today apparently has in mind not to hand a system over to posterity, but to hand posterity over to a system. You remember the myth of Procrustes, the evil giant fortunately slain by the hero Theseus. Before Procrustes thus got his comeuppance, it was his custom, he living in a house by the side of the road but being no friend to man, to force weary wayfarers whom he had invited to spend the night to lie down in an iron bed, where he stretched them to the length of the bed if they were short, or lopped off their legs if they were long, so that all who slept there might be equal. For centuries, any such device to distort and torture nature has been called a bed of Procrustes, but now we call it a burger bed or a bed of Earl Warren. To produce the kind of political plasma sought by the seers of socialism, it is essential, of course, to have the greatest of cultural revolutions. Intending to build a new heaven and a new earth, which will be one and the same for them, the insiders of the permanent conspiracy aim even more ambitiously to remake human nature, to fashion the new Soviet man. Only when men are different from what they have ever been before can the Soviet system work. And it is essential that the system should work so that the insiders themselves will never have to. But to make a new man, you must first destroy the old. The traditional human being has been shaped by tradition from generation to generation. The whole purpose of the education of the young has been to ensure that arts and sciences developed through past ages are not lost in some abysmal generation gap. It is a definition of the Dark Ages that they occurred when and where men lost the classical tradition. The barbarians were new men who remained destructive barbarians until they learned painfully the tradition which had, through the piety of the faithful, been kept alive, however imperfectly, in the monasteries. As far as we know, the barbarism of the Goths, the Huns, and other hordes from the east was due to honest natural ignorance. It remained for the intellectuals of our time to be the first to decide that the masses of mankind must be schooled in ignorance, must have all tradition erased from their minds, must be, in a word, brainwashed. Admittedly, there are difficulties in the path of this new pedagogy. There is no knowledge which is not from tradition, and this is true of the most advanced technical knowledge as well as of any other. Lee de Forest and Robert Hutchings Goddard, the fathers of the electronic and rocket revolutions respectively, are not less part of tradition than Dr. Johnson or Robert Browning. Enrico Fermi and Niels Bohr are as traditional as Columbus and Marco Polo. Einstein is so traditional as to have become mythical. Yet the revolution is reluctant for various reasons to let all knowledge of such as these perish from the earth. The new one world must be administered. Indeed, to facilitate administration is the most obvious motive of the cult of ignorance in the schools. Cattle and sheep require no calculus of their own. But administration involves administrators as well as administratees, and the former must have at least as much knowledge as a cowboy's, which means that not everyone can be cut off wholly from tradition. The boob in front of the tube does not need to know how to read, but the engineer who designed the tube must know something, as must even the entertainers and newscasters who appear on it. and someone near the top of the system needs to know a good deal about past culture so that he may realize the importance of what he is keeping from the masses. They say the Vatican has the world's greatest collection of pornography, and the Library of Congress may well be a close second. Both are careful not to let the New York Times have access. Now, it is not unprecedented that there should be areas of knowledge open to an elite group but forbidden to the masses. This was the basis of the hieratic despotisms of antiquity. What is new in America is that the traditional institution of democratic education, the public schools, should become the principal agency for the suppression of knowledge once thought to be of universal value. It never pays to underrate the conspiracy. Of course, it doesn't pay to overrate them either, for then we might give up. And I think we must recognize that some absolute genius among the insiders conceived the basic strategy of the public schools in America today. This anonymous genius faced the problem of how to restrict learning to the elite and deny it to the masses so that they might be more perfectly conditioned, without rousing their possibly dangerous resentment. Now, if you admit only a select few to the schools, resentment is certain among those who are excluded. But if you let everybody in and do an honest job of teaching, your elite will grow to an unwieldy size and proliferate in unpredictable ways so that you are rather certain to lose control. The answer? Admit everybody to the schools, nay, compel them to go. There, you can then confirm them in ignorance and call it education. They will be happy and never know the difference. Oh, now and then they will encounter a word like hypotenuse or a name like Charles Martel, which they feel ought to mean something, but they will quickly conclude that it cannot be important since they who are educated do not know it. Charles Reich, the Yale law professor, who is not to be confused with Charles Martel, says in the weirdly best-selling book, The Greening of America, that hippified young people, he says this in apparent seriousness, that hippified young people know all the right answers without being taught. That is the expressed opinion of a professor in the faculty of the law school of Yale University. But perhaps he only hopes to keep them from knowing that they do not know, which was the wisdom of Socrates. The ignorance of masses who complacently regard themselves as educated is essential to the conspiracy's operation of the totalitarian world state. That is why we have progressive subtraction of substance from our educational forms. Let me interrupt here something. We had in Mississippi just the other day a federal judge who enjoined the school board of Columbus, Mississippi from giving the national teachers examination to the faculty. He said, you cannot administer this. Now, that's a standardized test of knowledge of the subject matter to be taught. And the judge said, you cannot give that test to your teachers because 90% of the blacks will fail and 90% of the whites will pass, and therefore you will have an unjust situation. I'm not making this up. This is a federal judge, Orma Smith, in the District of Northern Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi, ruling on a case. In other words, there is no discrimination on account of race, color, creed, national origin, sex, or ability. It is unconstitutional to know more than someone who is ignorant. That's what he said. Now that's what I'm talking about here. I can tell by looking that most of you went to school some time ago. And you may be bewildered at some of the things I'm saying because you may not realize that it is contrary to national policy to teach anything in the public schools these days. It is knowledge which is the target, which is to be erased, because there are some people that can't get it, and that would be, well, there's more than that. Let me get back to the manuscript. It worked out. Progressive subtraction of substance from our educational forms. That is why we put blacks in white schools and then teach them black studies, which they might have learned better in black schools, but which we are not seriously concerned for them to learn anyhow. The serious social purpose of massive public school integration is not the difficult job of increasing the knowledge of the heretofore underprivileged blacks, but the comparatively easy job of increasing the ignorance and indolence of the whites. Now, the first advantage of reducing everybody to ignorance is that the ignorant are more malleable. The second advantage is that you condition them by Pavlovian methods to react as you want them to react, to salivate when the bell rings, meat or no meat. And that way you can save on the meat bill. Now, the purpose of the contemporary revolution in the public schools is manifold, and I'll enumerate some of the purposes. One, as an exercise in power. If you can force the people in the Deep South to integrate, you can do anything. Second, to take the child, and this truly without discrimination as to race, away from its parents. That's why busing is so important. Move them clear as far away as possible from the parents. 3, to prevent the child from learning old traditions. 4, to condition the child to respond to new signals. 5, to solidify the substructure of the new society in 2 ways. A, the children will influence their parents rather than vice versa. We have all heard of child informers against their parents in Soviet Russia. In America so far, the young are merely encouraged to regard their parents with more or less amiable contempt. Now, they're taught that in the schools. Your parents don't know anything. That's what they're told. Second, the parents will retire and die soon anyway, and the new generation, our posterity, will take the places as workers or as drones which the masters of the system have prepared for them. You and I, while we are still here, shall hardly know them, but we shall know them better than they will know us, for to them we shall be irrelevant. Such is the dream of the conspiracy. Fortunately, it is not and will not be fully realized. The quality of our young people is better than the planners realize. For every filthy hippie you can find, I can show you a dozen crisply mini-skirted cuties with dimpled red apple cheeks, long, clean hair which is not only washed but ironed. Yes, I think that America's young people, by and large, are splendid in spite of the trend of the educational system. Notice that I do not say in spite of the system itself, for it takes a long time to corrupt a great institution in a great country, and the existing schools and colleges have done much for many young people, even down to this day. The trend, however, is downward, and in the past 5 or 6 years, the rate of acceleration downward has been terrifying. A word which I do not use loosely or carelessly, but after concerned observation of the results of militant socialism throughout our educational system, particularly on the campuses of our major universities, in the schools of the central cities of northern metropolitan areas, and in the suddenly convulsed public school systems of the Deep South. Neurasthenia is becoming an occupational disease of public school superintendents. Many of them can undoubtedly see themselves being driven toward the fate of Washington, D.C., the city which as of 1954 had one of the best public school systems in the world, and which the late President Eisenhower declared after the Warren Court's order of May 1954 would become a showcase of integration. Now, the most chilling description I have read of that showcase, as it has come to be, was not written by any unreconstructed rebel or apocalyptic bircher, both of which I take pride in being. But by a certified liberal staff writer of the Scripps Howard chain, one Richard Starnes, who wrote in the Washington Daily News of December the 18th, 1969, under the headline, "The Nightmare of D.C. Schools," as follows. Enter the dirty tombstone-colored building, and you walk into a nightmare world where an aura of diffuse terror falls into step beside you. There is a sound in the air that bespeaks Kafka's madhouse, a subdued keening, a wordless language that murmurs violence, despair, savagery, and dread. The sound is an overture to hysteria, an obligato written for the destruction of a society. There are warders wherever you look, but it isn't a prison. There is the unmistakable stink of lunacy on the place, but it is not an asylum. Where you are is a public school. It might be any one of 100 in Washington, or perhaps in any other American ghetto around 1969. End of the quote. Now, let me remind you that was not written by any conservative. That was written by a liberal newspaper man about the nation's capital. Mr. Starnes is an effective writer, if something less than a profound thinker. It does not seem to occur to him that the lunacy which he detects by olfactory means does not originate in the ghettos of Washington or any other American city where its presence is so noticeable, but in the precincts of power where the insiders operate, the university campuses, the financial districts, the palaces of government, the councils of religion, and notably enough, the policy-making offices of the communications media, including, one may be sure, the Scripps Howard chain. The power structure of America decided in the wake of World War II to go along with what it took to be a leftward trend, recognizing only obscurely, if at all, that the trend is prompted by the conspiracy. Not recognizing at all, I believe, that the plans of the conspiracy envision that aforesaid remaking of human nature, which could certainly never be achieved without first destroying the traditional educational system. But the American Association of School Administrators, in a 1969 pamphlet entitled School Racial Policy. Now, this is the voice of the top of the educational establishment below the college level. Published by the American Association of School Administrators, 1201 16th Street, Northwest Washington, D.C. Copyright 1966. And they say on page 11, the American public schools today are charged with an unprecedented task. And it's true, it never happened before. Not to perpetuate a culture, but to transform it. This is why your child can't learn to read and write and add, because reading, writing, and adding are traditional, are part of the old culture. And that culture is to be eradicated and made different. There you have the key to the prison-like, asylum-like atmosphere which Scripps Howard's Mr. Starnes found in a junior high school in Washington, D.C. Now, one note is quite important to make. The deterioration of the schools in the District of Columbia is not due to the fact that 90-odd% of the students are black. I lived in metropolitan Washington for 6 years, 1947, 1953. And prior to the Warren Court's 1954 decision, when the District of Columbia had legally segregated schools, the all-black schools as well as the all-white schools were recognized as being of superior quality. So it will not do. Sometimes some of us Southern rednecks and some of the Eastern liberals seem to agree that the Washington schools are so bad because that's a bunch of black kids. And the liberals will say, well, it's because you treated them so bad. And we say, well, that's just because they are what they are. I mean, some of our people do, I don't. But the evidence is plain if you look back that the black schools in Washington in 1950, the all-black schools, were excellent. And the all-black schools in Washington today are hideous. So the change is not in the race of the students. The change is in the minds of the administration. That's where the lunacy is. Niggers can have good schools by themselves, the Supreme Court to the contrary notwithstanding. The public schools of Washington have become a Kafka's madhouse for basically the same reason that rock festivals from Woodstock to Altamont to Point Coupee Parish, Louisiana, have been open-air madhouses, because someone wanted it that way and industriously promoted it. Now, lest you think that observation of the erosion of knowledge is limited to aging conservatives, well, I'm aging, but everybody else is too. Consider the words of Herman Kahn and G.R. Urban, as reported in, of all places, the New York Times Magazine of June the 20th, a week ago Sunday. Herman Kahn is one of the most celebrated and notorious of the think tank defense intellectuals. Urban is a British scholar, editor of a volume to which Kahn will be one of the contributors, to be published in London under the amusing title, Can We Survive Our Future? Now, their concern with education is incidental to their preoccupation with the question whether civilization will reject the whimper for the bang. And since the danger of Holocaust is thought to come from nuclear science, some people, other than the insiders, imagine ignorance to be desirable. Kahn and Urban, however, more reflectively realize that ignorance is the precise kind of bliss which leads fools to rush in where angels fear to tread. Now let's break into their conversation. The English scholar Urban says, the vanishing sense of history is perhaps the most alarming aspect of the mismanagement of education. Now, here is a highly educated English scholar speaking as a matter of course of the mismanagement of education in the United States. I'm sure in England too, but they were talking primarily about the United States. Resuming Urban, one wonders whether it isn't a misnomer to talk of our information dispensing system as education. If our young people are not expected to know about the past, if they are led to believe that their situation is unprecedented, their predicament unique, then what, apart from pot? I don't know that any of you need to be told that that means marijuana. What is the mind-expanding stuff they are getting at our schools and universities? Now, that's the cultivated Englishman asking that question, and the think tank intellectual Kahn replies, there is a conscious attempt to maintain the qualities of childhood in adulthood. The outstanding quality would be ignorance, wouldn't it? The directness, spontaneity, and creativity of the child are now valued and encouraged, at least by the avant-garde. Like most Americans, continues Kahn, I like children, and I like these childlike qualities, unless, of course, Frankie is pushing 40. Now, Kahn's observation of a conscious attempt to maintain the qualities of childhood suggests that the program of ignorance in our schools is not the result of ineptitude, but deliberate. Knowledge comes with maturity and destroys innocence, and thus it is tempting to shield our children from certain areas of learning. Oddly enough, the very areas where they should be shielded, sex education, for example, are the only areas where the avant-garde insists on imparting knowledge. You know the real purpose of sex education? Sex is a very interesting field of study. And if you can lead the young into it soon enough, it will so absorb their interest that there will be little danger of their learning anything else. Let me point out in passing that compulsory school attendance is a form of involuntary servitude in plain violation of the 13th Amendment. I'm not going to stop and argue about that, but I just toss it off as an obvious fact. And in addition, it is child labor. So that compulsory child labor, now no longer brightened by the light of genuine learning and rapidly being transmuted into permanent slavery, is one of the great achievements of liberalism. Now, in all human difficulties, the way out begins at the bottom of the trough. And I imagine I have led you to suspect that I think we are near the bottom of the trough in our educational world. The destruction of education has gone so far as to finish off public schools in the Deep South and in the central cities of the North. But by the same token, this destructive process has forced a new start. And because of the Warren Court and the Burger Court decisions, that new start is in private schools. Here is a blessing which was indeed well disguised at the outset. I call it a blessing because prior to the Warren Court's decision in the Brown case, our public schools had not become bad enough to produce the significantly constructive reaction that we're now witnessing. We could well have drifted without corrective action further into the socialistic morass to which government schools inevitably lead. Our public schools have been America's greatest venture into socialism. They are themselves socialistic and they teach socialism. Since they don't do this honestly, they are in some ways even worse than the Soviet schools. But the paradox is that the socialism of our public schools has been fostered by the intellectual leadership of the private universities. Harvard, Yale, and Columbia are the most notable examples. These institutions, having led the public schools to a dead end, now turn upon themselves. The most eminent of our traditional educational institutions now take the lead in destroying traditional education. You're familiar with this tragic fact. I happen to have here the June 1971 issue, the last issue of the Yale Alumni magazine, which I get. Didn't ask for it, but I get it. The lead article is entitled, "Success, Who Needs It?" This is the Yale Alumni magazine. That's the lead article. After referring to an earlier study showing that 7% of American leaders in the 20th century had come from Yale, Harvard had furnished 8%, and each of these had only about 1/3 of 1% of the enrollment, so they were both coming out 20-odd% above average down to the present. This article then continues, but expectations in America and at Yale have been anything but normal for the last half-decade. In the view of most students, I get this, in the view of most students, America has gone sour, S-O-U-R. The notion of leadership has been discredited by too much bad leadership. And the high visibility of some Yale graduates in the process has made many Yale alumni ambiguous figures for emulation. End of quote. Now, when I reflect that William O. Douglas and Abe Fortas and Charles Reich are alumni of Yale, not to mention President Kingman Brewster himself, I have some sympathy for that last statement, share that feeling of disillusion. But let me ask seriously, does it occur to no one at Yale today that if the leadership has been and is bad, which is true, that the remedy is not to abandon the concept of leadership, but to replace the bad leaders with good ones. Our major universities no longer encourage their students to be leaders, except those few chosen to be insiders. And this additional quote, after college, many of the kids who have given up on the conventional roles will be playing out transitional chapters in their lives, traveling, living in communes, and even taking jobs as taxi drivers and dishwashers. End of quote. Now tell me this. Why are Yale professors paid, say, $30,000 a year to encourage undergraduates to despise success and take jobs away from taxi drivers and dishwashers who never had a chance to go to college? And as for traveling and living in communes, who needs a Yale degree to be a bum? It seems more than coincidence that an earlier issue of the Alumni magazine this spring reported an 18% decline in the number of applications for entrance to Yale. I hope that trend is not irreversible. But as of now, the Ivy League colleges are destroying themselves. As of today. And the state universities are not far behind. It is then, oddly enough, the prejudiced and ignorant Deep South redneck who is seeking a way to preserve the culture of which he has been himself, as he would hasten to admit, so sorry a specimen. If that sounds incredible, the reason is that it really isn't true. For the founders of private schools in the Deep South, the so-called segregation academies, are not actually illiterate rednecks. That is merely the way they are represented by their enemies, who include some of the worst scoundrels unhanged, as well as a vast body of the sanctimoniously ignorant. People who are concerned about the morality of segregation who have never been known to worry about the morality of anything else. Yet, despite the alternating hypocrisy and simplicity, too many of these enemies of private schools, who are thus enemies of education, have a plausible veneer of culture. They are educated a la mode and know how to assume a supercilious air. Yet the pose is likely to break in the corridors of a school in Washington or Brooklyn or New York, Chicago, Philadelphia. In the backward South, we were spared these tribulations somewhat longer than were the free states. Even after the Brown decision of May 1954, the South remained law-abiding for 10 years, refusing to follow the Supreme Court's illegal, unconstitutional interpretation of the Constitution. But in 1964, the Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which has been considered binding, except where it forbids busing. Reading this and the Discriminatory Voters' Rights Act of 1965, which followed, an act enshrining the sacred right of illiteracy, but only in the South, forward-looking citizens realized that the public schools of southern states were doomed. Doomed even more irrevocably than those of the central cities in the north, for the latter were surrounded by comparatively protected suburbs, while the southern states were surrounded by other southern states. Men of vision in the South instituted private schools as soon as it became evident that their public schools would be federalized. The prototype of the new private schools in the South is in the Prince Edward Academy in Prince Edward County, Virginia, which was one of the defendants in the original Brown versus Topeka case. When the Warren Court ordered integration with all deliberate speed, it was talking directly to Prince Edward County. And by 1959, the message had been translated to mean integrate immediately and completely. The County Board of Supervisors then refused to appropriate funds for the public schools, and citizens within the county immediately established the Prince Edward School Foundation, which built and operated very successfully the Prince Edward Academy for white children. A similar corporation was chartered to to put up a similar school for Negro children, and the Negroes would have been glad to do this, except that the militant black leaders wouldn't let them take advantage of that. For 2 years, the county went without public schools, which by their own choice meant that the blacks went without any schools. In 1961, the courts ordered the county to open the public schools on an integrated basis, and this was done. However, as in the District of Columbia, most of the whites did not choose to attend. The demise of the Prince Edward Academy, which had been confidently and cheerfully predicted by the liberals, did not occur. The academy continued to flourish as it does to this day and to provide a high quality of schooling. The key figure in the Prince Edward School was the late Roy R. Pearson, a retired official of the Standard Oil Company of New York, how about that, who realized the necessity for a private school if education were to survive in that part of Tidewater, Virginia. Mr. Pearson provided organizational know-how, common sense, tough determination, and educated outlook of his own, and financial support. A corresponding figure in the larger scene at Jackson, Mississippi, a few years later, was and is William J. Simmons, administrator of the Citizens Councils of America, a man, as we say, of substance, and also a varied experience in various parts of the world, having been in his youth, and he would not want me to exaggerate how long ago that was, served in the British Army in Trinidad, and somewhat later had the perhaps more exotic experience of being employed in Washington by the State Department, which he left. Incidentally, that stereotyped image of leaders in the promotion of these schools as being indeed illiterate rednecks could hardly be further from the truth. Of course, if anything were further from the truth, the liberals would come up with it. Roy Pearson's work with Soconi kept him 28 years in the Far East and Southern Asia. Simmons is a personal friend of Lord Graham, the former defense minister of Rhodesia, and has conducted a filmed interview with Prime Minister Ian Smith of Rhodesia. I could tell you about another leader in the private school movement in the Deep South, who not only is a learned academic doctor, but also was once engaged in the services of the investment bankers Lazard Frere. I hope Ed Griffin doesn't hear that. For his protection, maybe I'd better keep his identity secret. I'll just say we think he's all right anyhow. At any rate, I'll guarantee you he is no ignorant redneck. I keep using that term, which is common in Mississippi. I know that some of you honkies call us rednecks crackers. It all means the same thing. Let me briefly indicate to you the burgeoning nature of the private school movement by drawing your attention to three concentric circles of activity. The operation in Jackson, Mississippi by Council School Foundation. Second, the Mississippi Private School Association, a statewide organization. And third, the Southern Independent School Association, a regional body. I have been directly involved in the first two and have reliable information about the third. All of them have been encouraged and supported by the Citizens Councils of America, the body to which, as Reed pointed out, his distinguished father gave the best address we ever received. All of these schools are supported by the Citizens Councils of America and by the magazine The Citizen, of which I have the honor to be the managing editor. The aforesaid William J. Simmons is the editor. It was in September '64 that the Citizen published a question and answer handbook, How to Start a Private School. In January '66, at the Reed House in Chattanooga, the CCA held a conference on the theme, How Shall We Educate Our Children? Meanwhile, the first council school had opened in Jackson in October 1964 with a total enrollment of 22 pupils in 6 elementary grades. In the next year, there were 110 pupils in 12 grades, a nice rate of growth, but leaving a long way to go. Now, in the next 3 or 4 years, the foundation acquired additional sites, and as school began in the fall of '69, there were a total of some 500 students in 3 locations, which was a good, healthy operation, but not very large on the horizon in Jackson, Mississippi, which has a total school population of 40,000 children. All of these schools were, however, accredited, and they still are, and solvent, they still are. so that they were successful enough to embarrass liberals who had freely predicted their academic and financial failure, but they were still considerably short of dominating the academic scene. Therefore, then on October the 29th, 1969, the Supreme Court ordered the school revolution to begin in earnest in the Deep South generally and in Mississippi specifically. Somehow, after 15 years of more or less phony war, thousands of parents sensed that this was the real thing. Enrollment in our three council schools suddenly went from 500 in November 69 to 3,000 by the 1st of February 70. In 3 months, from 500 to 3,000. To accommodate this explosion in enrollment, what could fairly be called heroic measures were necessary, and Bill Simmons turned out to be enough of a hero to meet the need. The expansion of the facilities of the council schools in Jackson was the most dramatic that I have seen in my time, which is no inconsiderable amount of time, or at least since I went to Oak Ridge, Tennessee in the winter of 1944. Granted that the scale was different, nevertheless, in each case, during a cold, rainy, sometimes icy January and February, I saw a virtual miracle of construction. In the Jackson area, the modular two-room, mansard-roofed, interior paneled, carpeted, picture-windowed, air-conditioned classroom units went up row after row. And as they went up, the nation began to notice. The syndicated columnist James Jackson Kilpatrick came, saw, and was overcome, not only in his newspaper column, but also in the unpredictable periodical National Review. He exclaimed over the, quote, posh and professional, unquote, council schools in Jackson. Other journalists, media representatives, and public relations experts from Tacoma, Washington to London, England, Frankfurt, Germany, Rome, Italy, even from Sydney, Australia, came to publicize the extraordinary achievement. Articles and news stories appeared in U.S. News and World Report, the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, and other publications. One of the finest reports was contained in an advertising brochure of the American Plywood Association, which was evidently proud to record the success that the council school building program had using some of its materials. But let me read an excerpt from the Kilpatrick article in National Review. Quote, the Citizens Council, headed by Administrator William J. Simmons, already has learned and forgotten more about the efficient operation of private schools than many a New England headmaster ever has learned. For the past 6 years, of course that would now be 7, this article's a year older, by a process of trial, error, and hard work, Simmons and his associates have been learning about school architecture, building costs, maintenance costs, teacher contracts, liability insurance, and 1,000 other aspects of school operation. Drawing upon this pooled experience, the Citizens Council early this year pulled off a feat of construction, says Kilpatrick, that would have dazzled Cheops. National Review touch there. Starting from absolute scratch on 2 lightly wooded tracts in the Jackson suburbs, the council built and opened 110 handsome new classrooms at a cost, if you please, of $8 per square foot, or $4,000 per classroom. I venture the flat assertion, continues Kilpatrick, that not a single public school administration in the country could come within miles of that record, unquote. Now, in that last sentence, columnist Kilpatrick touches a nerve in every knowledgeable taxpayer. Public schools are subject to all the temptations which afflict any monopoly, and they do not yield any less readily than other monopolies. This is most lamentably true in the world of ideas, as we emphasized at the outset, and it is at least equally true in the world of money. There is a tremendous amount of money wasted in the public schools of this nation. The money and ideas are, of course, not unrelated. Often the plea that you hear for better facilities for our children, for the scrapping of existing buildings to put up new ones, the public schools in Jackson right now have just abandoned 8 perfectly good buildings and are putting up 2 unneeded new ones, educational plazas they call, which the people do not want. That's why our enrollment is increasing so fast. but at a great cost. Obviously because of federal rulings, but also because somebody wants to get the contract. Often the plea for better facilities is actually the voice of some hungry contractor ventriloquizing through a sedate superintendent. Much of the drive back of the craze for black studies comes not from the black population, but from representatives of textbook publishers who are anxious to make obsolete the whole list of existing textbooks. So they can rewrite them all and put the blacks in them, and then they can sell new textbooks. And when that's done, I suppose there'll be some new gambit. Though the textbook business is not a monopoly, it is an oligopoly, a cartel, and you might get Professor John Kenneth Galbraith to tell you how such powerful interests go about getting the public to buy whatever they want to sell. But back to a more pleasant subject, the rise of the private schools as illustrated by the beanstalk growth in Jackson. The council schools having jumped from 500 to 3,000 in one school year, went on to 5,500 last year, and the enrollment which is going on right now will predictably pass 6,000 in September. This increased by a factor of 12 or 1,100% occurring in 2 calendar years. I may say that despite some physical inconveniences in the first rush of building, that the quality of instruction and activities has increased with the increasing enrollment. There is an optimum size. A system or a school can well be too large, but it can also be too small for the best operation. As of right now, we happen to have, we think, the optimum size. We know we're going to have to get larger, but we'll deal with that the best way we can. The council schools in Jackson, the seniors, take the standardized test of the so-called American College test, the ACT. And their average scores are about 30% higher than the general average for the state of Mississippi. So when you hear people trying to imply that quality of education suffers from a new private school, the reverse is true. Quality of education increases. Now, considering, though, how new these schools are, and that both the teachers and the students have come entirely from the pre-existing public schools, the explanation of this superiority can't be just that we're doing a better job, because we haven't had the students that long. The explanation is that the best teachers and the best students are the ones that come over to us first. The ones that are still staying in the public schools are not up to it. Both among teachers and among parents, those who are most alert to impending changes are the first to leave the public schools and go to the private ones. It is ironic that while the political slogans of the liberal left stress the inevitability of change, it is the conservative right which first makes the constructive adjustment to change. It's a parody of the old spiritual, everybody talking about change ain't very smart about changing. Often we on the board of the Council School Foundation are asked whether we have difficulty in getting teachers, and the answer is no difficulty at all. As a matter of fact, the shift from public to private school preference came faster among teachers than among patrons, because the teachers were the first to realize that education was being sabotaged in the public system. I must say that this didn't at first hold true for administrators. They, of course, for principals and superintendents, that wasn't true right off the bat. They, of course, had the biggest vested interest in the old order and were understandably reluctant to admit that their ship had sprung an irremediable leak. Our first principals and superintendents were either very young or very old or remarkably prescient. But now we're getting all ages there too, but still only the brighter ones. At the outset, perhaps the chief reluctance to transfer on the part of students at the high school level stemmed from their attachment to the extracurricular and social activities that they were accustomed to in the public schools. This was an instinctive attachment to the familiar, a kind of conservatism itself, if you like. But in due course it became obvious that the familiar kind of social and other extracurricular activities were impossible in a revolutionary situation. They weren't leaving their school had already left them. But once the growth began in the private schools, then dances, dramatics, journalism. Here is a copy, by the way, of a school paper of one of these little schools. It's a very creditable job of one of the best school papers I've ever seen, technically speaking. All of these activities, even radio broadcasting, flourish on the school grounds of the council schools. As for athletics, the only problem there is to keep interest in football, baseball, track, golf, and tennis from diverting too much interest from other things, from studies. We share that with the way the public schools used to be. Some 80 private schools in Mississippi have an athletic conference subdivided into AAA, AA, and other categories of competition. If you enroll enough qualified young people and employ enough competent teachers in any 12th grade school system, you will have activities. You will have competition in athletics, you will have a competitive spirit in academic achievement, and this competitive spirit will extend to teachers and administrators as well as to students. The hundreds of private schools which have sprung up throughout the South are independent. They compete with each other, and they compete, quite frankly, against the public schools, not with them, because of various reasons. It does not take long for them to win the latter kind of competition, and they always profit by the former kind. Heretofore, even prior to the Revolution, the public schools suffered from that intellectual lethargy at the top, which is the inevitable concomitant of monopoly. You hear cliches about new ideas, but let me report with some admitted bitterness, and I'm bitter only because it's true, that in half a century of observation of the educational scene, I have practically never heard, even once, the superintendent of a large public school system express any interest in the growth of the mind, the cultivation of ideas, or the enlargement of knowledge. They are totally absorbed by the constant struggle within the monopolistic bureaucratic structure for position, political leverage, budgetary allotments, bond issues, textbook contracts, and other cash and power activities. Not that the administrators of private schools don't have to be concerned with these also, for these are necessary evils, if you like. But there is this difference. The private school administrators are, in effect, small businessmen selling a product directly to consumers. And the product they are selling is knowledge, is some evidence which the parents can see that their child has learned to read, write, and do sums, has gone on to enlarge his mind with information and ideas communicated and stimulated by teachers to whom the classroom is something more than a basis from which to demand more pay, is something more than a place to season idleness with socialist indoctrination. The new private school movement in the Deep South is possibly our most significant tactical victory to date in the struggle against the conspiracy. The 6,000 student council school system in Jackson, Mississippi is a veritable Incheon landing behind the lines of the Warren Burger Court, the federal bureaucracy, and what Ed Griffin called this afternoon the capitalist, unquote, conspirators. And from this beachhead and others like it across the South, the forces of true academic freedom have spread to form state associations. Our Mississippi Private School Association involves some 80 schools, and a regional body, the Southern Independent School Association. I am sadly familiar with the fact that Southern victories at Bull Run and Chancellorsville eventually led to Appomattox, but after Appomattox came 12 years later the Hayes-Tilden election. I get your friendly neighborhood historian to tell you about that. I'm not going to stop and tell you about it. But let me speak, but I speak now not as a narrow Southerner, which I am, but as a patriotic American, which I also am. And we have here highly resolved that this nation under God shall have a new birth of sound learning, and that education of the students by the teachers for the truth shall not perish from the classroom. Thank you very much.